The candles flicker against walls of stone. Perfumed smoke coils upward, mingling with the clamor of bells and the roar of a celebrating crowd. A royal wedding. To the world beyond the palace gates, it is a moment of triumph, a union of kingdoms, the sealing of treaties, the crowning of hope. But step closer, peer beyond the jeweled veils and the embroidered gowns, and you will see the truth. For the bride, tonight is not a beginning of love, but the end of freedom. You can almost hear the clash of two worlds. On one side, a spectacle crafted for eternity. Tapestries unfurled, processions winding through cobblestoned streets, choirs thundering hymns that echo to heaven. On the other side, a single young woman, draped in silk heavier than her body can bear, facing a future that has already been written for her. She is a queen now, but not by choice. Her crown is gilded iron, polished to shine, but sharp where it presses down. In medieval Europe, a queen's wedding was never simply about vows or affection. It was a chess move on the board of empires, each union carefully plotted to balance power, prevent wars, or forge alliances. Kings and councils traded daughters as if they were gold, tokens of trust exchanged to secure fragile treaties. Behind the music and feasts, behind the gilded chalices and jeweled crowns, the body of a queen was the parchment upon which politics were written. Imagine being there, standing in the echoing halls where banners fly, where courtiers murmur in Latin and French, where eyes follow her every step. Everyone sees a glowing bride. Few see the trembling child beneath. At 12, 14, sometimes younger, these girls were called women, their bodies judged not by years but by utility. Could they bear heirs? Could they bleed on the right night and prove what their families promised, that they were untouched, pure, a vessel ready to fill dynasties, with sons? Behind the gilded crown, there is terror. It hides in the silence of the bride's gaze, in the stillness of her lips as she recites vows she was told to memorize, words that bind her not to a man, but to a destiny. It hides in the way she lowers her eyes when the priest speaks of obedience, in the weight of her father's hand as he delivers her to a stranger. She has not chosen. She has been chosen. This is the paradox of the medieval wedding, a day celebrated as the highest honor of a woman's life, yet also the first day of her captivity. The feast may last a week, with venison roasted on spits, goblets overflowing with sweet wine, jugglers and musicians filling the night with laughter. But once the torches dim, once the gates close, the bride walks alone into a chamber where laughter cannot follow. And there, stripped of audience and crown, she will learn what it means to be queen. The wedding night was not a private affair of intimacy and discovery, as romantic tales later suggested. It was a ritual of politics, a performance of dominance. Medieval chroniclers describe it bluntly. The consummation of a royal marriage was the act that transformed a contract into law. Without it, the alliance meant nothing. The queen's body was the stage, and her blood the ink that sealed the pact. We often imagine history as distant, removed, painted in broad strokes of kings and battles. But pause and consider the human truth. Behind each treaty signed, behind each crown placed upon a young head, there was a girl who may have wanted nothing more than to remain a child a little longer. She may have loved the gardens of her home, the lullabies her nurse once sang, the laughter of brothers and sisters who now vanished behind political doors. She carried those memories like contraband, tucked secretly beneath the heavy brocade of her bridal gown. And yet she could not speak them. Silence was a queen's first lesson, taught long before she stepped into the bridal procession. Silence kept treaties intact. Silence held back scandal. Silence kept her alive in courts where rumors could kill as swiftly as daggers. On her wedding night, silence became her companion. Her duty was not joy, but endurance. Consider, for a moment, the cruel symmetry. The louder the public celebration outside the palace walls, the deeper the silence inside her chamber. Cheers rose into the night sky. Fireworks sparked over rivers, and peasants toasted to long life and many heirs. But the bride, locked behind carved doors, sat frozen, her fate sealed. The very alliance that brought peace to thousands rested on her ability to submit, to suffer, and to bear children she had never chosen to conceive. It is tempting to think of queens as powerful, draped in velvet, commanding legions with a word. But in these moments, power did not belong to them. It belonged to the men who arranged their marriages, the kings who claimed their bodies, and the church that sanctified their silence. Even the symbols meant to glorify them, crown, veil, gown, were chains disguised as ornaments. To understand the medieval queen's wedding night, you must unlearn the myths. This was not Cinderella's ball. It was a stage for survival, where a young woman learned, sometimes in a single night, that her body was no longer her own. Her worth was measured not by her dreams, but by her womb. Her tears were not hers to shed freely, for even sorrow could be twisted into scandal. Yet history remembers only the spectacle, the feasts, the treaties, the dynasties that rose and fell. The girl behind the veil, the one who swallowed her fear in silence, is rarely given voice. But here in the flickering shadows of this story, we can pause to listen. We can imagine the pounding of her heart. As the chamber doors closed, we can feel the weight of expectation pressing harder than the jeweled crown upon her head. And as you listen, ask yourself, what did it mean to be queen on that night? To the world, it was triumph. To her, it was terror, isolation, the loss of innocence disguised as ceremony. This was the foundation upon which dynasties were built, not romance, not choice, but silence. History tells us that crowns glitter, that thrones are gilded, that queens were honored. But behind the crown, behind the glitter, there was always the shadow of the chamber. And it is there, in that silence, where the true story begins. The cradle rocks gently, carved from oak, embroidered silks draped above like banners of destiny. But even here, in infancy, her life does not belong to her. Before she can speak, before she can walk, she has already been promised, her name whispered in negotiations, her future sealed in letters exchanged by kings. The child is not a child. She is an alliance waiting to be consummated. From the moment she takes her first breath, the girl who will be queen is surrounded by symbols of a life that is never her own. Nannies and nurses watch her carefully, not only to guard her health, but to preserve the fragile investment her family has placed in her body. Her laughter, her play, her curiosity, these things exist only in the shadows. What matters is obedience, restraint, and above all, chastity. She is groomed not for the joy of life, but for the ceremony of a chamber she has never seen. By the age of 5 or 6, her education begins, not in letters of love or poems of freedom, but in silence. Tutors teach her to lower her eyes, to walk without stumbling, to speak only when spoken to. She learns embroidery, music, and prayer, not as expressions of self, but as demonstrations of discipline. Every stitch she places, every hymn she memorizes, becomes proof that she is trainable, pliable, ready to submit. And always, the reminder lingers, her body is her family's treasure, her virginity its seal of honor. Priests warn her that her purity is holy, watched by angels and God alike. Yet in the same breath, she hears whispers that this purity is not truly hers. It is currency, measured, guarded, and one day sold. Imagine her at 10 years old, her hair braided with ribbons, sitting at a banquet where her presence is itself a negotiation. Noblemen glance at her, calculating her value. She does not understand their words, but she feels their gaze. She hears fragments, dowry, alliance, treaty. She realizes dimly that she is the subject, though she has not been asked. Already she is less a daughter than a promise. The crushing irony is that she is praised for virtues that erase her humanity. They tell her she is precious, yet forbid her to choose her path. They tell her she is holy, yet prepare to strip her of control. They tell her she is noble, yet use her as a pawn. As she grows, so too does the scrutiny. Her body becomes an object of surveillance. Did her figure change? Has she bled yet? Such questions pass not in whispers, but in open discussions among clergy, physicians, and mothers. Virginity is not a private matter, it is a public contract. When her first blood comes, it is not celebrated as a mark of womanhood, but as a signal that the family's investment can soon be collected. She is fertile. She is ready. Picture the quiet horror of this moment. The girl, barely 12, clutching linens stained red, while servants hurry to inform her mother. She may not fully understand what is happening to her body, but the court does. Her childhood has ended. Now she is eligible for marriage. Her family rejoices, but she trembles. And so begins the grooming in earnest. Queens in training are warned against laughter too loud, against glances too bold. They are told that a husband is both master and lord, that refusal is sin, that obedience is salvation. Some are given cryptic instructions by older women. Smile, but not too much. Be silent, but not cold. Above all, do not anger him. These are not lessons of love. They are lessons of survival. Psychologists today would call it conditioning, but in medieval courts it was simply the order of things. A girl's identity was molded into silence long before she was given away. She learned to hold back tears, to mask fear with composure, to endure without protest. The more she erased herself, the more she was praised. And what of the dreams she might have had? Perhaps she loved stories of saints who braved fire, or ballads sung by wandering minstrels. Perhaps she longed for a garden, for music, for laughter shared freely with friends. But such desires were dangerous. Queens could not afford longing. Their only dream permitted was duty. You can almost feel the weight pressing upon her small shoulders, the certainty that her worth lies not in her mind, nor her heart, but in her ability to bleed once, and then to bear sons. The bed becomes a looming figure in her imagination. She does not fully understand it, but she fears it. She hears whispers from ladies-in-waiting, half-hidden conversations about pain, about blood, about nights endured in silence. She clutches these fragments like warnings carved into her soul, and yet no one asks her what she wants. Her marriage is arranged while she is still playing with dolls carved of ivory, or while she still delights in the simple rhythm of skipping across gardens. Letters are exchanged across borders. Dowries are promised. She is a token in a game that she has never consented to play. Some were betrothed as young as 3 or 4, their futures mapped out before they could even spell their own names. They grew up knowing that they would be sent away, to a foreign court, to a husband twice their age, to a bed they had no choice but to share. Childhood, for these girls, was not a season of wonder. It was a countdown. And when the day comes, the transformation is swift. One morning she is a child in her mother's arms. The next, she is a bride in silks that suffocate, her innocence trampled beneath the weight of ceremony. The world praises her as queen, but inside she feels the hollow truth. She is still the girl who once laughed in gardens, now forced into silence, carrying the unbearable knowledge that her body is no longer hers. This is the cruel grooming of queens. From cradle to crown, they were raised not for freedom, but for a bed that defined kingdoms' fates. And as you follow her footsteps, remember, her silence was not weakness. It was the armor she was forced to wear, forged in childhood, preparing her for the night when silence would be her only defense. The girl queen sits in a chamber heavy with incense. Candles drip wax onto silver plates, shadows flicker across embroidered curtains. Around her, women whisper, maids, ladies-in-waiting, older queens who have already crossed the threshold she dreads. Their voices are hushed, conspiratorial, careful not to be overheard. But the words slip through like poison through silk, and what she hears is not romance, it is not bliss, it is warning. They tell her fragments, never the whole truth. It will hurt. You must endure. He will not wait. The words hang in the air, vague yet terrifying, enough to paint a picture darker than silence itself. One maid mutters of sheets stained red, proudly displayed as proof of purity. Another recalls a queen who wept so loudly her cries reached the guards outside the door. The girl listens, her chest tightening. Each whispered memory becomes her future. The church has told her that consummation is holy, sanctified by God, a sacred union that mirrors divine creation. Priests preach that obedience is salvation, that to submit is to serve both husband and heaven. And yet the whispers tell an other story, one of blood, agony, and silence forced upon trembling lips. How does a child reconcile the paradox that what is sacred is also cruel, that what is holy is also feared? Imagine her, still hardly past her 12th or 14th year, sitting before a mirror as women braid her hair in intricate coils, the golden weight of a crown pressing against her scalp. Her face is painted with the faintest blush, her lips tinted red, her body wrapped in silks she can scarcely breathe in. She looks like a queen, but inside she feels like prey led to slaughter, and the whispers do nothing to calm her. They sharpen the fear. One lady-in-waiting, older and bitter, leans close enough for her breath to brush the bride's ear. "Do not scream," she says softly. "He will not stop." Another tells her, "If you cry, do so into the pillow." And then, silence. The room hums with unspoken knowledge that this night is a trial, not of love, but of survival. This is the first glimpse of terror, not the act itself, but the knowledge of it. Fear fed by stories, warnings, and silences. In a court where women are trained to keep secrets, the truth leaks out only in fragments, like drops of blood before the wound. No one explains clearly, because clarity would be scandalous. No one comforts fully, because to admit the horror openly would be rebellion against the very system that binds them all. So the young queen collects these half-truths like shards of broken glass, piecing together an image she cannot fully see but feels in her bones. And what she builds in her imagination is often worse than reality itself. Psychologists today call it anticipatory trauma, the dread of what is to come, magnified by secrecy and whispers. For her, it is the dread of a chamber door closing, of a man entering not as lover but as conqueror, of a bed that becomes an altar of pain. Consider the cruel irony. Outside, bards sing songs of passion, of knights who kneel before queens, of love that conquers all. Inside, the real queen is taught the opposite, that her body will be conquered, that her tears must be hidden, that her silence is her only shield. Sometimes, the warnings take the form of superstition. Women whisper of herbs to dull the pain, charms to ease the bleeding, prayers to saints who once suffered. A few dare to share darker tales, of brides who never rose from their beds, their bodies broken by the violence of the night. Whether true or not, these stories coil around the young queen's mind, until every shadow seems alive with threat. And yet, she cannot escape. Her marriage has been arranged, her fate sealed by ink and wax long before she understood its meaning. To resist would not only shame her family, but threaten the alliance her body was meant to secure. Imagine the weight of that knowledge, that kingdoms rest upon her silence, that the peace of nations depends upon her tears being swallowed in the dark. At times, she dares to ask questions. What will happen? What must she do? The answers are vague, evasive, or cloaked in religion. It is God's will. It is a wife's duty. Think of your children. Rarely does anyone speak plainly. The silence itself is a form of cruelty, for it leaves her imagination to fill the gaps with terror. In this way, the wedding night becomes a specter long before it occurs. For years, she has been groomed for obedience, trained to smile, taught to endure. But now, in the quiet moments between ceremonies, she begins to sense the depth of the abyss awaiting her. The whispers do not prepare her, they only sharpen the edge of fear. And you, if you listen closely, you can almost hear her heart pounding. You can almost see her hands trembling as she clasps them in prayer, not for joy, not for blessing, but for mercy. She is not praying to love her husband, she is praying to survive him. Outside, the world rejoices. Bells ring, torches blaze, crowds cheer for the union of two great houses. But in the inner chambers, the truth lingers like smoke. This queen, like so many before her, walks toward a bed that is both battlefield and prison. She knows little, yet she fears everything. The whispers have done their work. Terror has taken root, and as the night approaches, she carries these fragments into her chamber, each warning echoing louder than the music outside. She knows that blood will mark her sheets, that her cries must be silenced, that her body is no longer hers. She has not yet endured the act itself, but already in her mind she has been broken. This is the cruel paradox of her world. The holiest duty is also the most feared, the most celebrated night is also the most dreaded, and the crown that glitters upon her head weighs heavier with every whispered warning she hears. The curtain has not yet fallen, the doors have not yet closed, but already terror has entered the chamber. The music fades, the last goblets of wine are drained, and the torches gutter low. Courtiers retreat to their chambers, leaving only the lingering scent of roasted meats and spilled ale in the great hall. But for the new queen, the night has only just begun. Her body trembles beneath layers of silk, her palms slick with sweat. She is led not to sanctuary, not to rest, but to ritual. This is the bedding ceremony, a spectacle masquerading as tradition, a public theater where intimacy is not private, but inspected, paraded, and verified. In the medieval imagination, a marriage was not real until it was consummated. The church could bless it, kings could decree it, treaties could declare it, but unless a man entered his wife, unless she bled, unless her virginity was proven, the union remained nothing. More than parchment and air. And so, attendants crowd around her, ladies-in-waiting, priests, noblemen, all with the solemn duty of escorting the bride and groom into their chamber. Imagine the scene. Laughter thinly veiled as courtesy, sly jests thrown between courtiers, the drunken shouts of men emboldened by too much wine. They tease the groom, mock the queen's innocence, joke crudely of what must happen next. For them, this is entertainment. For her, it is humiliation carved into ceremony. The queen, weighed down in jewels and brocade, is unfastened like an offering. Servants loosen her gown while others sing bawdy songs, stripping the sacredness from what should be private. Sometimes witnesses would even follow the couple into the chamber, lingering at the edges of the bedchamber, or waiting just outside the door. Their purpose was clear: to ensure the act was performed, to watch over the bride's body as though it were public property. The groom, often flushed with wine and pride, plays the part of conqueror. He may joke with his companions, may grin at the spectacle, unaware, or uncaring, of the terror etched into the bride's face. She is silent, her lips pressed tight, her eyes lowered. Every step feels like a march to execution. And then the door closes. The chamber darkens, but privacy does not follow. For the queen knows the ritual is not yet over. The sheets will be inspected. In some courts, attendants would return at dawn to collect them, to lift them high before the king's counselors, searching for the crimson mark that proved virginity had been taken. A stain of blood became the seal of alliance, a queen's pain transformed into political currency. Consider the grotesque symbolism. A nation's honor resting on the fragility of a young girl's body, her first blood paraded as evidence of purity, her suffering reduced to a spectacle. What should have been hers alone became the possession of an entire realm. The chroniclers of the age wrote of it bluntly. They did not veil it in romance. Some describe brides trembling, pale, fainting as they were led to bed. Others recount the laughter of courts waiting for confirmation, as though the queen's terror were nothing more than a wager to be settled. Even king's legitimacy could be shattered if no blood appeared. In such cases, whispers of scandal spread like wildfire. Perhaps she was not pure, perhaps the marriage was cursed. The queen's entire future, her status, her safety, could hinge on whether or not her body bled that night. Imagine the psychological torment. To endure such a night knowing that your body is not yours, that your pain will be inspected by strangers, that your silence will be judged as proof of obedience. The chamber is not a sanctuary, it is a stage. The bed is not a place of rest, it is an altar where the queen is sacrificed to the politics of men. And yet she has no choice but to perform. She cannot scream too loudly, for fear it will be taken as weakness. She cannot resist, for refusal would mean not only personal danger, but the collapse of the fragile alliance her body was meant to secure. Every movement, every gasp, every drop of blood becomes evidence in a trial she never consented to. The cruelty of this ritual lay not only in the act itself, but in its public aftermath. At dawn, servants carried away the sheets. The court buzzed with gossip. Had she bled? Was she truly virgin? Was the alliance secure? And if not, if no stain appeared, Rumors of annulment could surface. Whispers of scandal could taint her name forever. For some queens, the failure to prove virginity meant immediate danger, a husband's wrath, a father's shame, a church's condemnation. It is difficult, centuries later, to comprehend the depth of this humiliation, to imagine one's most private agony displayed like a trophy, discussed openly in council chambers, passed from tongue to tongue in the streets. And yet, for queens of the Middle Ages, this was reality. Their suffering was not hidden, it was demanded. You can almost see her now, lying awake in the dim glow of a single candle, staring at the ceiling while the echoes of the feast still throb in her ears. She is no longer a child, no longer a daughter, no longer free. She is a queen, but that crown, heavy with jewels, feels like chains upon her skull. Her body is bruised, her spirit hollowed, and yet before dawn breaks, she knows she must rise, smile, and present herself as the image of triumph. The alliance has been sealed, the kingdom is at peace, her pain is irrelevant. This ritual did not end with her. For centuries, queens endured the same spectacle, the same humiliation, the same theft of privacy. Their wedding nights were never their own. They belonged to the kingdom, to the church, to the whispers of the court. And so, behind every gilded crown, behind every painted portrait of a radiant bride, there was always this truth: the bridal chamber was not a sanctuary. It was a stage where queens were stripped not only of their innocence, but of their humanity. The feast has ended, the torches have dimmed, but the silence of that chamber will echo for a lifetime. The door shuts, the iron bolt slides into place. Outside, the laughter of courtiers fades into muffled echoes, leaving only silence. Inside the chamber, there is no feast, no celebration, no music, only the oppressive weight of expectation. The queen, still trembling, knows this is not sanctuary. It is confinement. And within these four walls, the power of the crown takes its most merciless form. For in the Middle Ages, a royal marriage was not simply blessed by the church or decreed by kings. It was enforced in the bedchamber. Here, power and cruelty intertwined so tightly they became indistinguishable. The king's will was law, and his queen's body, the territory he claimed as his own. Imagine her, a child of 14, sitting rigid on the edge of a carved oak bed, her silks heavy with sweat. Across from her, the king, perhaps twice her age, perhaps older, approaches not as a lover, but as a ruler ensuring his dynasty. His gaze is not tender, it is calculating. She knows that refusal is impossible. To resist is to defy not only her husband, but the throne, the church, and the kingdom itself. In this chamber, the word no does not exist. For some kings, the wedding night was a drunken blur, an act of lust performed with little thought for the trembling girl beside them. For others, it was deliberate cruelty, a reminder to the queen that she was not wife, but subject. Accounts whisper of kings who forced, who mocked, who treated their brides as objects to be broken into obedience. And always the queen endured in silence, for her cries could not change her fate. Think of the imbalance: a girl raised on obedience, taught that her value lay in submission, now faced with a man whose power stretched across armies, laws, and God's blessing. What chance had she? Her chamber was no refuge. It was a cage where her body became both battlefield and prison. The cruelty lay not only in the act itself, but in its repetition. The queen was expected to endure night after night, whether she wished it or not. Her worth was measured in heirs, in pregnancies carried to term, in sons born screaming into the cold halls of stone. Her womb was not hers, it was the kingdom's. Her silence was not choice, it was duty. Some queens found themselves trapped with men notorious for their brutality. Chroniclers whisper of kings who were impatient, who struck their brides, who cared nothing for their suffering so long as the bloodline was secured. Others speak of queens who prayed to faint, to fall unconscious, to escape for just a moment the reality of their bed. Yet escape never lasted. The chamber always awaited them. Even tenderness could be cruel in its own way. For even if a king approached with softness, the act was still demanded, still required, still devoid of choice. The queen could not say no. She could not delay. Her body was obligation, not gift. And what of the aftermath? A queen might rise from her bed bruised, hollow, trembling, but by dawn she was expected to smile, to walk into the great hall with dignity, to bow her head as courtiers congratulated her, as priests blessed her, as kingdoms celebrated the union she had been forced to consummate. Her public image had to be flawless, even as her private self fractured. Psychologists today would recognize this as trauma, an erosion of identity, a tearing apart of selfhood under the weight of relentless violation. But in the Middle Ages, such words did not exist. Instead, it was called duty. Instead, it was sanctified as holy. Instead, it was buried beneath silence. That silence was perhaps the cruelest companion of all. Queens could not speak of what they endured. To confess suffering was to risk scandal. To accuse a king was to invite danger. To cry too loudly was to reveal weakness. So they swallowed their pain, night after night, until it calcified into masks of composure. They learned to smile through torment, to sit upon thrones as though unbroken, even as their souls cried out in the dark. And yet the chamber was not always quiet. Sometimes it was filled with rage. Some kings, drunk or violent, lashed out when heirs did not come quickly enough. Queens bore bruises hidden beneath their gowns, scars veiled by jewels, pain tucked behind painted smiles. To the court, they remained radiant symbols of alliance. To themselves, they were prisoners in velvet cages. What haunts most is the realization that queens had no escape. Divorce was scandalous, annulments dangerous, refusal unthinkable. The very church that crowned them also bound them, declaring their suffering holy, their silence virtuous. They were caught in a web of politics and faith that sanctified their trauma as divine will. Still, within the cruelty, flickers of resilience glowed. Some queens endured not with joy, but with calculation. They learned to mask their terror, to endure until they found other forms of power, through counsel, through influence, through the quiet shaping of court politics. But in the chamber, all crowns fell away. There, stripped of jewels and gowns, they were not queens, they were captives. And you, if you dare to stand at the edge of that bedchamber, would see the truth the chronicles rarely admit. You would see the tears swallowed before they could fall. You would hear the silence that screamed louder than any cry. You would feel the weight of cruelty pressed into every stone of those walls, centuries of women enduring in silence so that dynasties could thrive. The chamber was never sanctuary. It was the place where power revealed its most intimate violence, where cruelty was sanctified, where queens learned that survival depended not on defiance, but on silence. And as dawn breaks, as the bolt slides back, as courtiers bustle in with trays of wine and congratulations, the queen rises from her bed. Her body aches, her spirit trembles, but her face is composed. The world must never know what happened in the silent chamber, for the kingdom celebrates. The alliance is sealed. The queen has done her duty. But behind her eyes the truth burns, a truth too dangerous to speak, too heavy to bear, too cruel to forget.